We are going to be covering Entity Framework code first. Going to be doing a little review of what you know and expanding upon what you know. And we're also going to be doing Entity Framework database first. In addition, we're going to talk about how to handle concurrency conflicts. We'll be reviewing our link to entity queries and the various CRUD commands that we have been using in our controllers. So to start with, we're going to kind of review the entity framework code first process. And the process involves creating our models first. And I'll just open a couple of these. And with our models, there are some conventions that entity framework follows. The first convention is it assumes that if you have ID for a property, or if you have the class name followed by ID, here we have ID, we have a bunch of them that are just ID. Let me pull up my other example. And this has got the class name followed by ID. Okay, it assumes that is your primary key. If the data type is integer, it also assumes that you have an identity column, and it is going to automatically generate values. Another little assumption that it makes is that if you have another class name followed by ID, that is a foreign key. So in addition to having the other class name followed by ID, you also need to have the class as a data type and as a property. Okay, and that combination it assumes is a foreign key. Okay, so you can see I have a foreign key in here as well. Okay, this is benefits, the foreign key is employee. Now, one thing that is different in employee, and you guys are going to actually be creating this, is that if you do not want Entity Framework to generate an identity column, there's an attribute that you can put in that is database generated option dot none. And this tells Entity Framework not to make this an identity column. Okay? It indicates that you want to key in the value yourself. Okay, so there is a little override that you can put in if you don't want the convention of identity column. Other conventions would be that strings are automatically going to get converted to variable characters with a maximum size if you do not include string length. If you set a string length property, then it's going to use that size. Okay, but if you don't override with any data annotations, it's going to assume the maximum size. Another thing that it assumes for strings is that they are nullable. And for integer and double properties, they are not nullable. Okay, so those are just conventions that Entity Framework follows when it eventually generates the tables. So once you have all of your models set up, your next step is going to be to install Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core tools. And you install those using NuGet Package Manager. After that's installed, you have to create your context class, and that is derived from DB context. And we have been putting the context with the models, but typically it's put into a separate data access layer or data folder, which is what I have here. And that is what you are going to be doing in the hands-on. And you'll notice that I actually kind of separate this out. There is a context, and then I have an initializer. So the context in this particular example is using the DB set properties, and that is basically identifying which entity class I'm using and then what I want to actually name the table that I'm going to be creating. DB context has two virtual methods that we can use to configure our class properties. There's on model creating, which is what we have been using. And here is on model creating. Inside this, we can use Fluent API commands to either configure properties or we can configure the tables themselves. We can specify keys, we can specify relationships using Fluent API. So this example is actually specifying keys and relationships, and you will be working with this later today in one of the hands-on exercises. Fluent API also lets you configure properties. When we execute database first, it will actually generate the models for us and it will generate the context file. And in that context file, here's an example of what you will be creating. In that context file, you will see a lot of Fluent API. If I can pull the right one up here. And in particular, there is a lot of Fluent API that configures properties. So in database first, instead of using data annotations, it uses Fluent API to configure all of those properties for the table. Okay, and that's where you're going to see a lot of these configuration commands. So today you are going to get to work with Fluent API quite a bit. You are going to be working with it in the code first example, and you're also going to work with it in the database first example. Okay, so here are several examples, and you are going to be working with things that are very similar. Once you have configured the tables and either used your Fluent API to configure properties or relationships, the next step is to provide seed values for your table. What we have been doing is we've been putting those seed values right inside the on model creating method. And we're going to do it a little different today. We're actually going to separate out an initializer file. And this is where we have the seed values. And when you set it up like this, you do have to change the program CS file so it'll run the initializer when you launch the app. So we're going to be covering that later on today too. But either you need to do it like this, where you have a separate initializer, or you have to put the seed values right in the context file, and you would put them in the on model creating method. That's what we have been doing in the past. After the initializer, you need to add your connection string, and that goes into app settings.json. And here is our connection string. Put a comma in, and then we added it. The startup CS file has to be modified to add the dependency injection for all of your DB context objects. And we have done this in the past as well. We add it to configure services. And here is the line of code. And it's basically specifying our context file. And this one is using the default connection, which is how you have to set it up for your term project. Once you have all of this, then you can perform migrations. And the commands that we use are add migration followed by a name. Okay, and if you remember, this creates a couple different files. There is one that has a timestamp. It's got the migration name.cs. That one is used to create the tables. And here I called it initial create. So it has an up method, and that is the one that creates all of the tables. And you can see it's got the indexing in there. It's got foreign keys specified. It also has a down method, which it will run through if we decide to remove the migration. Okay, so if we remove the migration, it goes through the down method. The other files that it has in here, the snapshot file, it's basically, if we do another migration, it compares the changes to what we had before. So it's kind of used internally by Entity Framework. And the designer has metadata in it that Entity Framework uses. So we don't really need to be concerned with those two as much. It's the initial create that is actually going to be creating our database and tables. So after we do the migrations, it's always a good idea to verify that your database was created and the tables are there. And if you did seed data, you might want to check to make sure the data is there. And then your next step is to generate the controllers and the views, and we've been using scaffolding for that. Once those controllers and views are created, then we customize our layout and we add to the navigational menu those pages that we want to be able to go to easily. So this is all information that we've been working with already this semester. The next section is going to talk about relationships.